Hello, Melanne. Very nice talking to you. Melanne, you are the Executive Director of the Institute for Women, Peace and Security at Georgetown University, and you were the United States Ambassador at Large for the Global Women's Issues from 2009 to 2013. And you are an intolerable advocate for women in leadership, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you.
Well, it's lovely to be with you again, Silvana. I always enjoy these opportunities. And I really want to thank you and your leadership of WPL and what you're doing, particularly with your focus on why women in peace and security, why women in peacekeeping, because it's so important. So I salute you and what WPL is continuing to do.
Thank you, Melanne. And actually, back in February at the Munich Security Conference, you joined the session that WPL hosted, which was about how to disrupt the perceptions of women for better leadership, meaning that right now we can see, even though there is multiple proof of the benefits for everybody to have more women in leadership positions, especially when it comes to peacekeeping and conflict resolution processes, we still see that women have a very hard time to get to these leadership positions. And based on your experience and your tremendous expertise in the area, what do you identify as the central challenges that women still face?
Well, I know that here we are, and we're all reflecting on this because we're marking the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council resolution that linked Women's Agency to peace and security. And I know that we're meeting on the occasion of the day set aside, the International Day on UN Peacekeepers. And we aren't doing well either in terms of women in peace building writ large or in the peacekeeping aspects of it. And I think there are a number of issues that should not continue to be barriers, but which are. But I think it's important up front to look at, for example, why does it matter so much? You know, today, and you've been a part of this, we've got a growing evidence-based case that demonstrates very clearly with all kinds of data about the effective outcomes that come out of this. And we know that this is no longer an option. It really is a necessity if we're going to be more effective when it comes to peace and security and the peacekeeping aspects of that. So, you know, if we look just at where we are on women in peacekeeping operations, for example, you know, I think we have something like 5% in terms of the armed forces. I think we're already only, as much as we've been trying, 11% in policing, and that's a higher number than it's been, a little better on the civilian side. But that's not enough. Fortunately, there's been more of an emphasis on this. There's been greater leadership. There have been targets set, but the targets don't get met. Certainly, they don't get close to being met. There's small progress, progressive steps. And yet, when you look at this space, women make a tremendous difference. They have proven themselves in the numbers that have been participating. Men never have to prove themselves in this space, but for some reason, women have to confront a wholly different standard. And yet, when you look at what the job is in terms of participating in operations that matter, just take the role of, I think often about MONUSCO in the DRC because it's the largest UN peacekeeping force. And there are all of these rebel groups that are wreaking havoc, and sexual violence is a terrible tool of the war there. And yet the peacekeepers, who are all about civilian protection, need to know what are the early warning signs? What can we find out about what's going to happen? Where are these rebel groups gonna attack next? What is the intel we can get? And women, time and again, in these situations, have established close relationships with communities, trust relationships, confidence relationships, and they play that important role. So when you look at the demographics of societies, men and women, we can't just be focused on one segment of the society and not all of the society. And there's so many different points that can be raised about why it's important. Mm-hmm. But as you just asked, what are those barriers? Why does it not happen when it is such a reasonable proposition and such a necessity? And we know it is an advantage. And we know that we would be more effective. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to peacekeepers, for example, we know where the troops come from. They come from the contributing states. If you look at those countries, many of them are anemic in terms of women's participation in their national armies, in their policing work, and yet they are the channel, that pipeline, if you will, for the UN peacekeeping missions. So you've got situations in states that need to be addressed, need to be remedied. We're also dealing with, and we see this across the board, Silvana, that one of the hugest problems we have got to figure out how to overcome are these mindsets, norms, deeply entrenched cultural practices, biases, conscious or unconscious, but they say a great deal. And when it comes to military engagement, there is a stereotypical view, call it that warrior view, but yet women have the strength, they have the capacity, they've got the power, but somehow it doesn't mesh with the expectations in this cultural mindset. And then I would say that another barrier is clearly how these structures were set up. The gatekeepers were traditional actors, military actors, and the ability of women, many of whom are extremely eligible by all standards, somehow there is a discriminatory structure that doesn't make it as possible. I think one of the things that we should all look to is the fact that Canada has made a real significant commitment in this ELSI initiative to look at why we aren't doing better in terms of women in peacekeeping operations, given how important they are. And in that context, really looking at barriers, looking at obstacles, what happens to women post-deployment, those few who do get in, what role do families and the care responsibilities that women have enter into it? And then how do we go through that list of barriers, some of which I just mentioned? So I think we're going to get to a better place, but right now we are not there. And as we mark this day that you and your organization have singled out with great importance, which it is, we really need to be more mindful of how we're going to change those patterns that continue to exist, those patterns that continue to discriminate against.
Melanne, there is a lot of talk about building back better after this pandemic, and of course COVID-19 affects also the security landscape and the attempt to have peace. There was the call from the UN Secretary General for ceasefires, which is and also the attempt to pass a resolution in the Security Council on the pandemic, which included also these calls for peace, which for a number of reasons did not pass. But do you see in the changing landscape through this COVID-19 pandemic an opportunity to address and to overcome the barriers that you just described?
Well, I hope there will be, Silvana. You know, you and I both know that in some of the darkest times in history, there have been opportunities for change that have come out of that. And we've seen a lot of severe outgrowths in this whole COVID-19 crisis. One, for example, are the great inequalities, the disparities that we're seeing. We're seeing them certainly in terms of gender disparities. I'm hearing from women on the front lines in some of those conflict-affected states right now, in refugee situations and internally displaced situations, where they have the experience, they have the capacity, and they are not really part of the decision-making process on the ground. So these are learnings. I think we have to collect what's going on, get through this terrible time, but really learn from this. And you pointed out, I think, so sharply, the reality of the UN Secretary General's call for a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities in those places that are raging with war. So they're raging with war and all of the consequences of that, but also now raging with a disease that is a terrible contagion. And he asked the world to come together to create those humanitarian corridors so that emergency relief can get through. Now, in some places, there has been a positive response. And I think hopefully there will be more of that. But we should seize with every diplomatic possibility we have to go into those situations where there are cessation of hostilities and try to let them lead to the potential in terms of a more sustainable peace. So I think that's one potential opportunity that can come if we seize it. You're so right about the Security Council. It's been a tremendous disappointment. I personally, as an American, the bickering that's gone on between the United States and China, the fact that a resolution, good faith efforts up until a few days ago, as we're discussing this, have failed. We need more leadership out of the Security Council at this time. It is about peace and security. That's its predominant role. And I think we do have to continue to work to make the best possible come out of this. So immediately what we're seeing is what we've been seeing all too much, is more marginalization of women in terms of the higher and the community and higher level decision-making processes, but they themselves are on the front lines. And women are doing that heavy work, whether in terms of being health practitioners or in terms of alleviating some of the economic burden, going to the rescue in terms of protection in places where you can't social distance often, and there isn't even access to water or to the rudiments of what you need to have clean hands. So it is an issue, and I hope we seize the possibilities on the bright side.
Well, I share that hope very much so, Melanne, and let me thank you for sharing your insights and experience, also your opinion on those super important matters, specifically because this year was supposed to be remembered as a year that has a lot of opportunity to take stock of equality between women and men, given the many important anniversaries of the Beijing Declaration of Resolution 1325, which calls for women in peace and security. So while we continue working on this, you continue working this with your very, very strong voice in the US and globally. And thank you for taking this interview.
Well, thank you, Silvana, and for your leadership and for WPL's work. It's really important.
Thank you.